I went solo camping in late September, the kind of time when the air is cool enough to keep bugs down, but not cold enough to push people out of the woods yet. The leaves were starting to turn, but hadn't fallen much, so the forest still felt full and closed in. I chose a state forest I knew well enough for past trips, but I planned to hike farther than most people bothered to go. I wanted distance, quiet, the kind of place where the trail thins and stops feeling maintained. I parked at a small gravel lot just off a forest road. There were no other cars. That didn't surprise me. It was a weekday, and the weather forecast showed clear nights but colder temperatures. I checked my phone one last time. 1 week bar flickered and disappeared as I locked the car. I knew from experience that I would lose service within the first mile. I didn't mind. I had maps printed, a compass, enough food, and a basic emergency kit. I wasn't reckless, just alone. The hiking took a little over 3 hours. The trail narrowed after the first mile and started to climb gently. Fallen branches crisscrossed parts of it, and in some places the path was more suggestion than a line. I paid attention to landmarks. A bent pine near a creek crossing, a long fallen log parallel to the trail, a patch of moss-covered rocks shaped like steps. I like to know where I am without needing to check. The forest smelled like damp leaves and cold soil. Every sound carried. My boots on dirt, my breathing, the occasional bird taking off. Nothing felt wrong. It felt empty in a normal way. The campsite was a clearing setback from the trail, close to a small stream. It was marked on the map, but barely used. When I stepped into it, the first thing I noticed was the tent. It was pitched near the edge of the clearing, tucked between 2 trees. Old green fabric, sun-faded and dull. Not the bright colors most people use now. The stakes were in, the lines tight. It looked intentional. It didn't look abandoned in the way trash sometimes does. There was no fire ring with fresh ash. No gear outside. No footprints obvious in the soft dirt, at least not at first glance. I stopped walking and just stood there for a minute. My first thought was that someone had hiked out for water or a day hike. Maybe they were deeper in the woods. The second thought was that I didn't like arriving at an occupied site without knowing it. I walked the perimeter of the clearing slowly, keeping distance from the tent. I listened. No movement, no coughing, no sounds of someone shifting weight. The tent fabric didn't move in the breeze. It was still. I decided to set up anyway. The site was big enough, and I put my tent far off, closer to the stream, but not too close. I made sure I had a clear line of sight to the other tent without being right next to it. I told myself I would leave if someone showed up and it felt off. As I set up, I paid attention to details without meaning to. The other tent's zipper pulls were hanging straight down, not half open. The fabric looked stiff, like it had been there longer than a night. There was no condensation on it, even though the air was cool and damp. I cooked dinner as the light faded. The woods went quiet in stages. Birds stopped first, then insects. The temperature dropped fast. I sat on a log and watched the trees darken until the clearing felt like a hole cut into blackness. No one came back to the other tent. That should have been reassuring. Instead, it made me uneasy. I told myself the person might be staying somewhere else nearby, or maybe they had left the tent behind earlier that day. People do strange things. That doesn't mean danger. I went to bed early. I zipped my tent fully and kept my headlamp and knife within reach, more out of habit than fear. The forest was still. No wind, no animal movement I could hear. My breathing sounded loud inside the tent. Sometime later, I woke up without knowing why. That happens to me sometimes when camping. I checked my watch. Just after 2 a.m. At first, everything was quiet. Then I heard it. Fabric shifting. Not footsteps. Not branches snapping. Just the soft, slow sound of nylon being pressed and dragged. Like someone crawling inside a tent. The sound came from the direction of the other campsite. I held my breath and listened. The noise wasn't steady. It came in small movements. A push. A pause. Another push. There was no zipper sound. No cough. No voice. Just fabric under pressure. I stayed completely still. I didn't move my head. I didn't reach for my light. I waited for the sound to stop or change into something that made sense. It didn't. It went on for several minutes. The tent fabric would stretch slightly, then relax. I could picture hands pressing outward, weight shifting inside. But the tent didn't collapse or fall. It held its shape. I told myself maybe an animal had gotten inside somehow. Maybe someone had left food and a raccoon or bear cub was stuck. But the movements were too controlled, too slow. Animals panic when trapped. This felt deliberate. Eventually, the sound stopped. Not abruptly. It faded, like the pressure eased and whatever was inside settled. I didn't sleep after that. I lay there until the sky started to lighten, every muscle tense. No more sounds came from that direction. The forest stayed still. At first light, I packed only what I needed to move around. I left my tent standing. I told myself I would just check, then leave. I approached the other tent carefully. Up close, it looked worse. The fabric smelled wrong, stale like damp metal and old sweat. Not rot, but something sharp underneath. I crouched and unzipped the entrance. The tent was empty. There was no sleeping bag, no pad, no backpack, no food. The floor was flattened, deeply creased, like someone had been lying there for a long time, shifting back and forth. The fabric walls bowed outward in places, and when I looked closer, I saw handprints. They were pressed from the inside, smears where palms had dragged, finger shapes stretched toward the seams. Not claw marks, human hands. The fabric was worn thin in those spots, as if the pressure had been repeated many times. There was no blood, no dirt, just those marks and that smell. I backed away and packed my gear fast. I didn't try to break down my tent neatly. I shoved things into my pack and shouldered it without caring about balance. I left the campsite without looking back. On the trail out, I focused on my steps. I told myself to stay calm, to move steady. The woods looked the same as the day before, but everything felt closer. Every sound made me glance to the sides. After about 20 minutes, I noticed the footprints. They were beside mine, matching my pace. Same tread pattern, same size. They weren't deep, just clear enough in the soft soil to see. They stayed close, never crossing, never falling behind. I stopped walking. The prints stopped. I waited a full minute, then moved again. They continued. They followed me all the way to the trailhead. When I reached the gravel lot, my car sat alone where I had left it. The prints ended right next to the driver's door. There were no other tracks leading away. Nothing circled the car. Nothing went back into the woods. I unlocked the door with shaking hands and got inside. I locked it immediately and sat there, breathing hard, staring at the trees. I didn't drive right away. I waited, watching the edge of the lot, half expecting to see movement. Nothing happened. Eventually, I drove out. When I reached the first stretch of road with cell service, my phone lit up with notifications. I didn't check them. I kept driving until the forest thinned and the road met a highway. I reported the tent to the ranger station later that day. I told them exactly what I saw. They took notes. They said they would look into it. I never went back to that forest. I sold most of my old camping gear and replaced my boots a few months later. I didn't throw the old ones away. I still have them in a box. Sometimes I take them out and look at the soles. The tread is worn in a way I don't remember earning. We went camping in early fall, the kind of weekend where the days are still warm but the nights drop fast. A small group of us had taken time off work and picked a familiar forest we'd all been to before. Nothing remote or extreme. Just a big public campground that allowed dispersed sites if you stayed far enough apart. We chose separate spots for space. My friends set up near a bend in the river where the ground was flat and open. I took a site about a quarter-mile away, deeper into the trees. I like being close, but not right on top of people. I could still hear them faintly if the wind carried sound, but mostly it was quiet. My site sat on slightly higher ground. Pine needles covered the dirt in a thick layer. The trees were tall and spaced enough that moonlight filtered through at night. I set my tent, cooked, and walked back to my friend's fire once it got dark. We stayed up for a while, then drifted off to our own sites. Nothing felt strange at that point. The forest felt normal. I crawled in my sleeping bag around 11. The fire ring at my site had burned down to warm coals, so the area glowed faintly. I remember thinking how still everything was. No wind, just the soft sound of the river far away. Sometime close to midnight, I noticed light flickering through the trees. At first I thought it was my friend's campfire, but it was coming from the wrong direction. Their site was downhill and closer to the river. This light was deeper into the forest, well past where anyone should have been camping. The campground rules were clear. No fires past a certain boundary, and no one I knew had wandered off that far. The light wasn't steady. It appeared, vanished, then appeared again in a slightly different spot. It didn't move smoothly like someone carrying a torch. It was more like a fire being lit, going out, then lit again farther along. I watched it for several minutes from my tent. The light stayed low to the ground, orange and uneven. It didn't crackle loudly. I couldn't smell smoke. That bothered me more than the light itself. I told myself someone might be lost. A hiker who had strayed too far and was trying to signal or keep warm. I didn't want to ignore that and regret it later. I grabbed my headlamp and put on my boots. I didn't bring anything else. I figured I would walk a short distance, call out if I saw someone, and turn back. As soon as I stepped away from my campsite, the forest seemed darker. My headlamp cut a narrow tunnel of light ahead of me. The firelight flickered again, maybe 50 yards away, then vanished. I walked toward where I'd last seen it. The ground dipped slightly and then rose again. Pine needles muffled my steps. I expected to hear branches snapping or leaves shifting, but there was nothing. The forest felt muted, like sound was being absorbed. The firelight reappeared ahead of me, still the same distance away. It wasn't getting closer, even though I was walking straight toward it. That should have been my sign to turn around, but I didn't. I kept thinking I would crest a small rise and see someone crouched over a fire pit. 10 minutes passed. The light stayed ahead, always just out of reach. It never brightened or dimmed. It didn't move sideways. It just appeared, disappeared, and appeared again. My headlamp began to dim. At first I thought it was my eyes adjusting. Then the beam shortened. The edges went yellow. I tapped the lamp with my finger, then checked the strap. I had put fresh batteries in it before the trip. It shouldn't have been failing. The firelight stopped. It didn't fade. It just wasn't there anymore. I stopped walking and stood still. That's when I noticed how quiet it had become. No insects, no distant water, no wind through the trees. Even my breathing sounded wrong, too loud and too close. I turned around. Nothing looked familiar. The trees were closer together than they should have been. The spacing felt wrong, like I had walked into a part of the forest that didn't exist on the map. The ground sloped in a direction I didn't recognize. I couldn't see any sign of my campsite or the path I'd taken. I stood there longer than I should have, trying to force my brain to make sense of it. I told myself I had simply veered off without noticing. That happens more easily at night. Then I heard the sound of flint striking. A sharp scrape. A spark flashed low to the ground behind me. Then another. The sound was deliberate. Slow. Controlled. I didn't wait to see more. I ran. I didn't follow a trail. I pushed through brush and low branches, ignoring the scratches on my arms. My headlamp flickered, but stayed on just enough to keep me from tripping. I didn't look back. I didn't listen for footsteps. I focused on moving forward, on forcing air into my lungs. The forest opened suddenly, and I stumbled into my friend's campsite. Their fire was still burning low. The familiar shapes of their tents and gear snapped into place like a picture locking into focus. I collapsed near the fire, shaking and gasping. No one was awake, but I didn't care. I stayed there until my breathing slowed and my hands stopped trembling. Nothing followed me out of the trees. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat by the fire until dawn, replaying the sounds and the light over and over in my head, trying to find a normal explanation that fit every detail. In the morning, once everyone was up, we went back to the area I thought I had followed the fire into. We walked slowly, spreading out and watching the ground. We didn't find a trail. We didn't find footprints leading in or out. About 15 minutes from my site, we found a patch of dirt where the ground was blackened, like a fire had burned there recently. There was no fire ring, no rocks, no ashes blown around by wind, just scorched soil in a rough circle. Around it were boot scuffs, not clear prints, just disturbed dirt like someone had shifted their weight over and over again in the same spot. There were no tracks leading away from it. The forest around that spot was quiet even in daylight. No birds landed nearby. The trees grew closer together there, their branches tangled low. We didn't stay long. We packed up earlier than planned and left that afternoon. I checked my headlamp later at home. The batteries were drained completely, swollen and leaking slightly. They should have lasted days. I don't follow lights in the woods anymore. Not fires, not reflections, not headlamps in the distance. If someone is lost, I report it. If something wants to be followed, I assume it knows exactly what it's doing. I camped beside the lake in early summer, right after the last of the snowmelt had settled and the trails opened back up. The water was high and cold, the kind that stays dark even in full sun. I picked that spot because it was quiet and far from the main campground. It took a long hike to get there, and most people didn't bother hauling gear that far when easier sites were available. Bears were common in that area. Not rare sightings, not rumors. Actual posted warnings at every trailhead. I had camped there before, so I came prepared. I brought a hard-sided cooler with metal latches and a lock point. Every night, I locked it and wedged it under a fallen log so it couldn't be dragged. I kept all food, trash, and anything with a smell sealed inside it. I didn't cook near my tent. I didn't leave scraps. I followed every rule because I knew how fast things could go wrong if you got careless. The first night was calm. The lake stayed smooth even after sunset, reflecting the trees like black glass. Frogs croaked along the shore. Something large moved in the brush once, but that's normal in bear country. I stayed alert, kept my headlamp close, and slept lightly. The second morning, I woke up early and went to get food. The cooler was open. The lid wasn't forced. The latch wasn't bent or broken. The lock was still clipped through the metal loop, intact, hanging loose like it had never been securing anything in the first place. The cooler sat exactly where I had left it. No drag marks, no overturned dirt, no claw marks on the plastic. Nothing was missing. All the food was there. The sealed packages were untouched. Even the bag of trash from the night before was still inside, tied tight. No smell of rot. No sign of an animal getting frustrated and giving up. I stood there longer than I should have, staring into it, waiting for my brain to catch up. Bears don't open coolers carefully and leave food behind. Smaller animals can't defeat locks like that. And if a person had opened it, they would have taken something, even by accident. I told myself I must have forgotten to lock it. I replayed the night before in my head. I remembered kneeling by the log, pushing the lid down, snapping the latch. I remembered the sound. But memory isn't proof, and I didn't want to jump to conclusions. I locked it again, double-checked the latch, and went about my day. The rest of that day passed without anything unusual. I fished along the shore, walked the perimeter of the lake, watched clouds build and break apart overhead. The place felt empty, but not in a threatening way. Just quiet. That night, I locked the cooler again and crawled into my tent earlier than usual. I told myself I was being cautious, not scared. Still, I didn't fall asleep easily. Every sound stood out. The water lapping against the rocks. The wind moving through branches. Something splashing far across the lake. Around 3 a.m., I woke up. At first, I thought I was hearing my own breath echo inside the tent. Then I realized it was coming from outside. Slow breathing. Close. Not snorting or huffing like an animal. Not irregular. It was steady, controlled paced. In through the nose. Out through the mouth. Close enough that I could hear the slight pause between breaths. I didn't move. I didn't reach for my headlamp. I didn't shift my weight. I lay flat on my back, staring at the dark fabric above me, listening. The breathing stayed there for what felt like a long time. It didn't move around the tent. It didn't circle. It stayed in one place, just off to my left, near where the cooler sat. My heart beat so hard I worried it would give me away. Then the breathing stopped. The silence after was worse. No movement replaced it. No footsteps retreating. Just nothing. A few seconds later, I heard the cooler lid creak open. Slowly, the hinge made a low sound, stretched out, like whoever was opening it was trying not to let it snap. I heard the faint shift of plastic as the lid reached the top. No rummaging followed. No rustling of wrappers. No clatter. Just the lid opening. I stayed frozen until my muscles ached. Eventually, the lid closed again with the same careful control. The latch did not snap shut. Nothing else happened. I didn't sleep after that. I watched the sky lighten through the mesh window, counting minutes until I could see clearly. I expected to hear footsteps leaving. I never did. At dawn, I waited several more minutes before unzipping the tent. The campsite looked the same as always. No one stood near the trees. No movement by the water. The cooler was open. I approached it slowly, scanning the ground. The dirt was hard-packed near the log, but I could see faint scuffs, like someone had stood there shifting weight. They weren't clear enough to identify footwear, just disturbed soil. Inside the cooler, the food was still untouched. I moved the top layer aside and saw something that hadn't been there before. A folded piece of bark. It was from a tree I didn't recognize near the lake. The inside surface was pale and freshly exposed. Scratched into it were tally marks. Deep grooves cut with something sharp. They were clean and straight, not rushed. I counted them. 7. I stood there holding the bark, my fingers numb, my mouth dry. I didn't need to think hard about what it meant. I knew exactly how many nights I had planned to stay. I had arrived early. I had intended to leave after a full week. I packed immediately. I didn't eat breakfast. I didn't take time to organize gear. I shoved things into my pack and left items behind that weren't essential. I didn't bother to rebury the cooler or clean the site. I wanted distance, not order. As I left, I kept scanning the trees and the shoreline. I never saw anyone. I never heard movement. The hike out felt longer than it should have. Every bend in the trail made my stomach tighten. I reached my car by late afternoon and drove straight home. A week later, while unpacking, I found the trip notes I had written before leaving. Dates, route plans, food rations broken down by day. 7 nights. I realized then what bothered me most. The marks weren't counting down. They weren't crossed out or grouped by days past. They were complete. Someone had been tracking the length of my stay, not guessing it. They hadn't taken food because they didn't need to. They hadn't rushed because they had time. They had been close enough, often enough to know my routine. I don't camp near lakes anymore. I don't stay multiple nights in the same spot. And I never assume that because something isn't taken, it hasn't been touched. Some people don't steal. Some people watch. I reserved campsite 14 online a week in advance. I remember checking the confirmation twice because I like knowing exactly where I'm going. The receipt said 14. The campground map on the website showed 14. When I printed the permit at home, it said 14 again. There was nothing unclear about it. I arrived in the late afternoon when the sun was low enough to cut through the trees at an angle. The campground road was gravel, narrow, and poorly maintained. It felt older than the rest of the park, like it hadn't been updated in a long time. Campsites were spaced far apart, which I liked. You could see signs for most of them from the road, small metal plates nailed to posts. I drove slowly, counting as I passed each one. 12, 13. Then I saw it, a post with a faded metal sign that read 14. The site sat back from the road, partially hidden by brush. The number matched my reservation, so I pulled in. The ground was uneven, with patches of gravel mixed into dirt. The fire ring was old but intact. No trash, no fresh ash. It didn't look used recently, but not abandoned either. I parked, unloaded, and set up my tent before dark. The area felt quiet in a way that didn't stand out at first. No nearby campers, no voices, no music. I assumed I just had an isolated site, which happens sometimes. As night fell, the temperature dropped fast. The air smelled dry and cold. I cooked a simple meal and sat by the fire until it burned down to coals. Everything felt normal. I zipped up my tent and went to sleep early. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to the sound of gravel crunching. Slow footsteps, heavy ones. They weren't rushed. They weren't light. Each step pressed down hard enough to grind stone against stone. The sound moved around the perimeter of my sight, not in a straight line. It circled. I lay still and listened. There was no flashlight beam, no cough, no talking, just the steps, one after another, steady and patient. I assumed it was another camper who got turned around, maybe someone looking for a bathroom or the right site number. I waited for the sound to move off. It didn't. The steps continued, completing another slow loop around my tent. The gravel path around the fire ring made the sound clear. Whoever it was didn't step into the dirt or grass. They stayed on the gravel, where the noise carried best. I stayed inside my tent and didn't speak. I didn't want to startle anyone or escalate something unnecessary. I figured they would realize their mistake and leave. Eventually, the footsteps stopped. I waited a long time before relaxing. I didn't hear anyone walk away, but I told myself the sound must have faded with distance. I fell asleep again closer to dawn. In the morning, the campsite looked unchanged. No trash, no footprints obvious in the dirt beyond my own. The gravel showed signs of disturbance, but gravel always does. It's hard to tell fresh from old. I packed a small day bag and decided to hike to the ranger station. I wasn't scared, just unsettled. I figured it would be good to mention the noise in case someone else had gotten confused or wandered into the wrong site. The hike took about 40 minutes. The ranger station was quiet when I arrived. I described the footsteps and the circling. I mentioned my site number. The ranger didn't respond right away. They pulled out a large printed map and spread it across the counter. They traced a finger along the campground road, stopping and starting. Then they looked at the screen behind them and pulled up another map. Their expression changed. Not alarmed, but focused. They checked the map again. Campsite 14 wasn't listed. They told me it had been decommissioned years ago after an incident. Not something recent. Long enough back that it didn't come up often. The site was supposed to be closed. The sign removed, access blocked. It wasn't meant to be reservable. They said the system shouldn't even allow a booking for it. I left the station feeling cold despite the sun. I told myself it was probably a clerical error. Old data that never got cleaned up. A missing update. Still, I walked back faster than before. When I reached the turnoff, my stomach dropped. The sign was gone. The wooden post was still there, but the metal plate with the number had been removed. Freshly. The bolt holes were clean and bright, not rusted. The sign hadn't fallen off. Someone had taken it. I walked into the site. The fire ring was cold. Dead ash. My tent was exactly where I had left it. My gear was untouched. I looked down at the ground. My footprints were there, clear enough in the dirt and fine gravel. They showed where I had walked around the site, where I had paced while setting up. They did not show how I arrived. There were no tracks leading in from the road. I followed the edge of the clearing, scanning carefully. The gravel road showed tire marks from my car, but no footprints branching off toward the site. It was like I had appeared there without walking in. There were other footprints, though, heavy ones. They circled the site slowly, pressed deep into the gravel. The stride was wide, deliberate. They overlapped themselves in places, as if the person had made multiple loops. There were no prints leaving the site. I packed my tent with shaking hands. I didn't take time to roll it properly. I stuffed it into the bag and loaded the car. I didn't sit down. I didn't rest. I left. On the drive out, I passed the ranger station again. I didn't stop. I just kept going until the campground road turned into pavement. Later, at home, I checked my reservation again. It still said Campsite 14. The confirmation email hadn't changed. The map attachment still showed it. There was no note about closure or reassignment. A few days later, I checked the campground listing online. There was no Campsite 14. The numbering skipped from 13 to 15. I never heard back about the incident. No follow-up email. No explanation. I don't think the site disappeared. I think someone kept it usable. The sign didn't remove itself. The reservation system didn't glitch on its own. Someone knew the site wasn't supposed to exist and made sure it still did, quietly, without drawing attention. The footsteps weren't someone lost. They were someone checking. And when I mentioned it, the site was erased again. I don't camp at numbered sites anymore. I don't trust maps that don't match the ground. And I don't stay anywhere that feels forgotten but still maintained. Some places aren't abandoned. They're managed. I was a few days into a solo trip when it happened. Late summer, just before the weather starts to turn. The forest was dry, the ground soft with needles and old leaves, the air smelling like sap and warm dirt. I had been hiking most of the day and decided to camp near a small stream marked on my map. It wasn't a popular route, but it wasn't untraveled either. A quiet middle ground, the kind of place where you still expect signs of other people, even if you don't see them. I set my pack down at the edge of the water while I filtered. I leaned it against a pine tree I could see clearly from the stream, no more than 30 feet away. I remember the exact angle. Left strap twisted slightly. Hip belt resting on a root. Nothing hidden, nothing out of sight. The forest was calm. No wind, just the sound of water moving over stones and the occasional bird call. I fill my bottle, screw the cap on, and turn around. The pack was gone. At first, my brain refused to accept it. I stood there staring at the tree, waiting for the shape of it to appear, convinced I was just looking wrong. I even took a few steps closer, checking behind the trunk. Nothing. No pack. No straps. No shadow where it should have been. My first thought was that someone had taken it as a joke. That idea didn't make much sense, but it was easier than the alternatives. I hadn't heard footsteps. I hadn't heard fabric moving, but people move quietly in the woods all the time. I scanned the ground and saw a disturbed line in the leaves. Pine needles pushed aside, dirt scuffed, a drag trail leading away from the tree. My pack was heavy, fully loaded. Whoever moved it hadn't lifted it. They had dragged it. I followed the line, calling out, expecting laughter or a response or anything that would make this normal. My voice sounded wrong in the trees, too loud and thin. It went unanswered. The trail curved downhill, away from the stream. Leaves were pressed flat, needles crushed into the dirt. The line was steady, not erratic. Whoever dragged it hadn't stumbled or changed direction much. They knew where they were going. The trail ended at a shallow ravine, maybe 15 feet across. Not deep, just a cut in the ground where rainwater had carved a channel over years. On the far side, my pack sat upright, neatly placed. It wasn't tipped over or tossed aside. It was standing the way someone would set it down, carefully. The zippers were open, not ripped, not forced, just opened. I approached slowly, every nerve awake. I expected something to be missing. Food, gear, something valuable. Everything was there. My stove, my clothes, my map. Even small things like my headlamp and first aid kit were untouched. Whoever had opened the pack had looked inside and decided not to take anything. Then I saw the sock. It was placed on top of my clothes, centered, impossible to miss. A child's sock. Small, gray once, now darkened with age and dirt. The fabric was stiff, like it had been wet and dried over and over. The heel was worn thin. I knew immediately it wasn't mine. I don't hike with kids. I don't carry spare clothing that isn't mine. And even if someone else had dropped it in my pack as a prank, it didn't make sense. Why that? Why take the pack, move it so far, and leave everything intact? I stood there longer than I should have, staring at it, trying to convince myself there was a reasonable explanation. I picked it up using 2 fingers. It smelled old. Not like rot, but like something that had been kept in a damp place for a long time. I put it back where it was. I didn't want it in my hands. I didn't want it in my pocket. I zipped the pack closed and carried it back to my campsite, checking over my shoulder every few steps. The forest felt closer now, thicker. Sounds seemed muted again, like they were being swallowed before they could travel. I set up camp early. I chose a spot with a clear view in every direction, or as clear as you can get in dense woods. I ate without much appetite and cleaned up fast. As the light faded, my unease didn't fade with it. It sharpened. I put the sock in a separate pocket of my pack. I didn't throw it away. That might sound strange, but leaving it behind felt worse. Like it would mean something. I went to bed early, zipped my tent fully, and lay still listening. The night was quiet, but not empty. You can tell the difference when you've spent enough time outside. Sometime after midnight, I heard movement. Not footsteps, a dragging sound. Slow, controlled, something being pulled across the ground with care. Back and forth, then a pause, then back again. It was close, too close. I could hear leaves shifting, pine needles scraping, the faint sound of something brushing against the tent wall, not touching it, but close enough that the fabric moved slightly from displaced air. I didn't move. I didn't reach for my headlamp. I didn't unzip the tent. I didn't even change my breathing. I stared at the dark ceiling and listened. The dragging continued. The sound traced a path around the tent, steady and methodical. Whoever or whatever it was didn't rush. It didn't stop suddenly. It wasn't random. It was deliberate. At one point, the sound stopped right near the zipper. I felt pressure on the ground beside me, like someone had knelt or leaned close. I held my breath until my chest hurt. Then the dragging resumed. The path widened. The circle grew. Eventually, the sound faded into nothing. Not retreating footsteps, just silence. I didn't sleep after that. I watched the tent walls lighten slowly as dawn approached, every muscle locked tight. When the sun finally broke through the trees, I waited longer, just in case. Outside, the ground told the story clearly. Drag marks circle my tent. Not messy, not overlapping much. A near-perfect ring, like someone had measured the distance carefully and kept it consistent. The marks were deep enough to see clearly in the needles and dirt. There were no footprints crossing the circle. No approach, no exit. I packed up immediately. I didn't eat. I didn't boil water. I shoved everything into my pack and left. I didn't follow the trail I came in on exactly. I chose a faster route out, even if it meant rougher ground. I didn't look back. When I reached my car hours later, I sat inside for a long time before turning the key. My hands shook when I finally did. At home, I unpacked slowly. I checked every pocket, every strap, every seam. The sock was still there. I threw it away that night, sealed in a bag, put deep into the trash. I didn't feel better afterward, just empty. Later, I thought about the ravine, how the pack had been placed, how nothing had been taken, how the dragging around my tent hadn't crossed itself. Someone had strength, someone had patience, someone had time, and they had been close enough to touch my things without leaving a trace of how they came or went. I still hike, I still camp, but I never leave my pack unattended anymore, not even for a minute. And when I hear something dragging in the woods, I don't assume it's an animal. Animals don't put things back the way they found them. I had planned the trip for weeks. The fall had been dry, the leaves crisp and brittle underfoot, and the forest trails practically empty. It was perfect for the kind of solitude I wanted, the kind that lets you breathe, think, and forget everything outside of the trees and the smell of dry leaves and pine. I wanted quiet, uninterrupted quiet. My backpack was heavy with food, a small stove, a tent, and enough layers to keep me warm when the nights dropped into the 30s. I arrived at the campsite late afternoon, the sun still bright, but angled low, painting everything gold and orange. I set up a small clearing I had found near a ridge. The ground was uneven but firm, the surrounding trees tall, straight, and spaced enough to give me some privacy without feeling completely boxed in. I collected kindling, small twigs, and dry branches that snapped easily in my hands, and arranged a small fire pit I had dug out just enough to keep embers from spreading. I had been camping alone before, but something about this site made the forest feel older, quieter, heavier. Not threatening, exactly, just aware. By the time I finished arranging the fire, the sun had dropped below the ridgeline, leaving long shadows and a sudden chill. I sat on a flat rock and unpacked my small stove, lighting it with the steady flick of a lighter. As the flame caught, I muttered half sentences to myself, as I often did when I was alone in the woods. Complaints about the day, the awkward pack, the stiffness in my knees. Always too much. Why does this never? I didn't even realize I was speaking aloud, the words tumbling out without thought. Then I noticed it. From somewhere deeper in the woods behind me, there was a sound. At first, it was so faint I thought it might be the wind moving through branches, a branch brushing another. Then I realized it was matching me. Not words exactly. The rhythm of my muttering, the half sentences, the pauses between each fragment. The sounds weren't clear language. They were impressions of my voice, mimicking my breathing, my small sighs, the odd clicks of my tongue when I was frustrated. I froze, sitting rigidly by the fire, spoon hovering over the soup. Every time I exhaled, a corresponding sound came from the dark beyond the firelight. Every pause I held was matched. The sound stopped when I stopped, and I stopped. My heart beat loud in my chest. I could feel it, the pressure in my ears, the tightness in my stomach. I wanted to convince myself it was someone else camping nearby, but the nearest trailhead was more than a mile back. The forest was dry and quiet, and the sound, however it was being made, was exactly following me, copying me, and it had started only after I had spoken aloud. The fire began to feel small and fragile. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, just beyond the cone of light. It wasn't moving toward me, not exactly, but it was there just far enough back that the trees hid it from view. I ate quickly, spoon clattering against the bowl, tried to convince myself the noise had stopped. For a few minutes, there was nothing, just the crackling of the fire and the rustling of dry leaves from wind that had picked up, a soft, constant hiss through the branches. After I cleaned up, I crawled into my tent, zippered it shut, and tried to relax. My sleeping bag was stiff for being packed tightly all summer, and I wrapped it around myself, hugging my knees. I told myself it was just nerves, but then I heard it. The zipper of the tent moved. Not all the way, just a small inch, like it had been nudged, then stopped. My stomach dropped, and then I heard my own voice. Not loud, not full sentences, but a small sound I made when I was nervous. A tiny exhalation, almost a sigh, but sharper than I ever thought anyone could hear from inside my own mind. It wasn't coming from me. I hadn't made it, at least not consciously. My heart thudded against my ribs, so hard I was afraid the noise would echo into the night. Alert whatever it was that I knew was there. I didn't move. I couldn't move. I could only breathe slowly, carefully, counting in my head to keep from making another sound. The night was long. Every tiny noise, the snap of a branch under wind or animal, the scuff of leaves brushing together, made me flinch. Every shadow that moved just beyond the thin fabric of the tent felt deliberate, intentional. I could hear nothing precise, no footsteps or breathing, just the constant, oppressive feeling of being mirrored, watched, timed. When I closed my eyes, I saw the silhouette of whatever was out there, perfectly aligned with mine, pausing when I paused, mimicking everything. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. By the time the first pale light of sunrise touched the top of the ridge, I had decided I wasn't staying another night. I packed slowly, cautiously, checking the perimeter of the campsite for any sign of tracks or disruption. There was nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, no movement in the brush. The fire had burned down to embers. The leaves around my site were untouched, and yet I knew something had been here. My stomach still twisted when I remembered the zipper, the whisper. I hiked out as soon as I could. Every step on the dry leaves felt too loud. I kept glancing over my shoulder. I never saw anything, not even a shape. By the time I reached my car, sweat and cold leaving me exhausted, the forest looked like any other forest, bright and empty, completely ordinary. I drove home with my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. Weeks later, I tried to convince myself it was nerves or maybe the mind playing tricks. I started taking recordings of myself when I camped. Small audio tests, capturing the night sounds and the way I breathed, the way I moved. That's when it happened again. On the recordings, there was always a second breath. Always behind mine, delayed by a fraction of a second. Perfect in rhythm, perfectly matching the sounds I made. Sometimes it was almost imperceptible. Other times, it was exactly there, every intake and exhale doubled by an invisible presence. I stopped questioning whether I had imagined the first night. Whatever it was, it had found a way to mark my sound. It followed me, not physically, not close, but in the echo of my own presence. I never camped alone again without checking recordings afterward. I never stayed in a new site without the same ritual of testing, leaving small audio devices running. And sometimes when I listen to those old recordings, the second breath is there, always just behind mine, a faint rhythm that shouldn't exist. I've never seen a footprint, never caught anything moving, and yet it exists, and I know it will always exist when I'm out there. The forest is silent, ordinary, and I am never completely alone. I arrived at the campground in the late afternoon. The sun hanging low over the ridge, the sky streaked with pale orange and fading blue. It was a small forested park I had passed by dozens of times, but somehow never visited. The road in was narrow, gravel-packed, and twisting, bordered on both sides by tall pines and oaks whose trunks were mottled with moss. When I pulled into the main lot, I expected a few other campers, maybe a family setting up a tent or a couple of cars parked near the loop. But there was nothing. Empty spaces, gravel paths undisturbed, picnic tables unoccupied. I parked, opened my trunk, and unloaded slowly, listening to the soft wind rustling dry leaves. The silence was heavier than I anticipated, not empty exactly, but full in a way that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I picked a site near the far end of the campground, the one that felt most private. The ground was flat, covered with a thin layer of dry pine needles and scattered leaves, the kind that crunch underfoot. I set up my tent meticulously, hammering stakes into the soil until they were secure, arranging my sleeping bag, flashlight, and small stove inside. Around me, the other sites were unmarked, the fire pits clean and empty. Not a car, not a person, not a sound except for the occasional wind brushing the trees. By early evening, I had cooked a small meal over my stove and packed away the dishes. I stepped outside, stretching, and that's when I noticed them. Fires. 6 of them, maybe more, spread in a loose circle around my site. Each one was low, barely more than embers and faint flames, steady, patient. They weren't close, maybe 50 feet or more between each, but the arrangement was deliberate. I scanned the area for cars, tents, anything that would indicate someone was nearby. Nothing. No headlights, no distant voices, no movement. Just the fires. I felt a prickle of unease, but told myself they were abandoned, left by campers who had long since gone. I walked carefully around my site, trying to get closer without stepping too much on the dry leaves. Each fire was contained, small, low, steady. No smoke drifted high into the air. It clung close to the ground, curling lazily in the cool evening breeze. I circled the entire campground loop. Nothing else. No footprints beyond the obvious vehicle tracks from the day. No sounds other than the whisper of leaves. By the time I returned to my tent, the light was dim and the first stars were appearing. I built my own fire in the pit at my site. The flames flickered higher, warmer, brighter than the others, and I watched them hungrily as night fell fully. The forest darkened, shadows spreading thick and sharp between the trees. The other fires remained, each one small and steady, no more than a subtle glow against the black. I ate slowly, trying to convince myself I was imagining the strangeness of the circle. But as I moved about my site, I couldn't shake the feeling that the fires weren't random, that someone had placed them with intention. Around midnight, it happened. One of the distant fires sputtered, hissed, and went out. Just like that. A soft pop, a faint hiss, then nothing. I froze, sitting on the edge of my sleeping bag, staring into the darkness beyond my firelight. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, a few seconds later, another fire, opposite the first, dimmed and died. I could hear something, feel something moving closer. Footsteps? The forest was dry, and the ground would have made sound, but it was faint, uneven, slow. Almost like someone was deliberately placing their feet softly, testing, circling. My stomach tightened. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I watched my own fire, clinging to it, unwilling to shift my gaze. Another fire went out, then another. I counted silently, trying to orient myself. By the time the third fire died, the movement seemed closer, sharper in the silence. My skin prickled. I knew instinctively to stay put, to make no noise, to keep the fire alive. I did nothing but watch. By 3 in the morning, all the fires around me were extinguished. Only my fire remained, bright, steady, stubborn against the black and cold. I didn't add wood. I didn't sleep. I just sat huddled in my sleeping bag, legs pulled close, listening. The forest seemed ordinary again, the wind brushing leaves, a distant owl calling, but I couldn't shake the feeling I was being studied, circled, measured. Dawn came slowly, the sky turning from black to gray to pale pink. I felt drained, exhausted, tense in every muscle. I stepped out of my tent and looked around. Every fire pit where the others had been was gone. Not a log, not a coal, not a scrap of ash. Just flat ground where someone had stood, indistinct and pressed into the dirt and pine needles. No footprints, no tire marks, no sign that anyone had been there at all. It was as if the fires had existed, burned, and then vanished, leaving nothing but impressions in the earth. My fire was the only thing left untouched, stubbornly smoldering in its pit. I packed slowly, meticulously scanning the perimeter, listening to every rustle, every creak. The campground looked ordinary in the early light. Birds chirped, wind moved through the trees. The gravel path to the main road was dry and empty. I left carefully, taking only what I had brought in, glancing over my shoulder again and again. The memory of the fires, the quiet footsteps, the deliberate extinguishing of each one stayed with me. It wasn't supernatural. I know that. Something human had been there. Something deliberate. Something calculated enough to leave no trace but impression. I never returned to that campground. I told myself it wasn't worth testing, that the people, whatever they were, had chosen that night, chosen that way, and I had no place in it. But the images lingered, the fires small and low, perfectly still until they weren't. The movement slow and methodical around me, the silent dawn revealing only empty ground. I thought about it every time I camped afterward. I checked fire pits, inspected the circle of the forest. I never saw anything similar again, never understood fully who or what had been there. But I knew. I had witnessed something deliberate, planned, and completely human, and it had left its mark in a way I couldn't prove, couldn't escape, but would never forget. The clear lesson stayed with me. Some spaces, even ordinary campgrounds, aren't empty, and not everything that disappears leaves evidence behind. The forest looked innocent in the daylight. The earth looked undisturbed, and yet, that night, I had been surrounded, studied, circled, and I was the only one who had left alive, unburned, untouched, the sole survivor of an unseen ritual of movement and patience. The memory stayed sharp, like the imprint of a footprint pressed into soft dirt that the world couldn't see, but I could feel, clear as the sky above the ridge at sunrise. I had planned a short overnight hike, something simple to clear my head. The day was dry, the leaves crisp beneath my boots, the sky pale blue with only a few clouds drifting across it. The trailhead was easy to find, the parking lot nearly empty, a few scattered signs warning about ticks and sudden weather changes. I carried a small backpack with essentials: water, a stove, a light jacket, a sleeping bag, and enough food for 2 meals. My plan was straightforward. Hike in, set up a small camp near the stream I had marked on the map, spend the night, then hike back in the morning. The trail in was easy at first. It wound gently through a mixture of pines and oaks, wide enough for 2 people to walk side by side. The dirt was firm, scattered with dry leaves that made a satisfying crunch underfoot. Sunlight filtered through the branches, making the forest feel calm and open. I noted landmarks carefully: the shape of a large oak at a bend, a cluster of rocks near a small stream, the slope that led to my eventual campsite. By late afternoon, I had arrived at the spot I had picked weeks ago, a small clearing with enough space for my tent, a fire pit that looked as if someone had used it before, and a view of the stream below. I set up my tent slowly, hammering stakes into the ground, making sure it was secure. I gathered small sticks and branches for a fire, enough to last the evening. The air was cool, carrying the faint smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. I built a small fire, just enough for warmth and light, and cooked a simple meal. Afterward, I sat by the fire, enjoying the quiet, the water gurgling below, the occasional bird calling from the trees. The sun set in shades of pink and orange, shadows stretching long across the forest floor. The night was calm. I went to sleep feeling content, unaware of anything unusual. The next morning, I woke early. The sun had barely risen, casting pale light through the trees. I packed up my camp, extinguished the fire, and headed back along the trail I had memorized on the way in. For the first hour, everything seemed normal. The trail was clear, familiar, wide enough that I could see the bends and markers I had noticed the day before. I walked quickly, anticipating the end of the hike, the road, and the car waiting for me. Then, gradually, the trail began to narrow. The sides of the path, once lined with open spaces and low bushes, grew denser with ferns and saplings. Roots protruded from the ground, twisting and catching my boots. I slowed down, thinking it was a minor change, the forest shifting naturally. But after another half hour, the trail forked. Not just any fork. It split in a place I was certain it hadn't. My mind tried to rationalize it. Maybe the trail had eroded. Maybe a minor branch had created a new path. I hesitated, looked at both directions. One path was rough but slightly familiar. The other was narrow, overgrown, almost imperceptible. I chose the familiar route, the one I thought would lead me directly to the road. I walked for an hour. The light grew warmer as the sun rose higher. The forest felt quiet, still almost unnervingly so. Then I saw it, the clearing where I had camped. I froze. My stomach dropped. I had passed my own campsite just as I had remembered it, but everything was wrong. The fire pit was cold, completely cold, and my tent, the carefully staked tent I had set up the day before, was gone. No fabric, no poles, no signs it had ever been there. Only the disturbed ground where I had set up, flattened dirt and pine needles. I looked down at my boots. My footprints in the dirt were scattered, leading off in every direction except the one I was standing on. It made no sense. I remember the path I had walked. I knew the landmarks. Yet here I was, standing in the exact place I had camped, seeing only the remnants of my own presence and the absence of everything else. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. I considered turning around, retracing the trail I had just walked, but nothing looked familiar. The forest felt different now. The light filtering through the trees seemed harsher, shadows sharper, every sound amplified. The rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig, the faint chirp of birds. I realized I couldn't trust the trail. If my campsite could vanish from memory and position, then the path might have shifted too, or maybe I had walked in a circle without noticing. I decided to follow the sun. If the trail was unreliable, at least the sun would guide me roughly east of the road. I walked slowly, deliberately, scanning the forest for any sign of markers, tire tracks, or familiar terrain. The underbrush grew thick, branches scraping my jacket, roots tripping my boots. I walked for hours, dehydrated, tired, but unable to rest. The sun shifted across the sky, changing the angle of the shadows, making the forest feel even more disorienting. By mid-afternoon, I realized I had passed several features I thought I had seen earlier. The bend in the stream, a large oak with a hollow trunk, but nothing matched precisely. It was like the forest had rearranged itself while I wasn't looking. Every time I thought I was following a straight line, the ground subtly curved. The path of least resistance turned me slightly off course. I tried to maintain a sense of direction, focusing on the position of the sun, keeping track of time. Finally, as evening approached, I emerged from the forest onto a dirt road. Relief washed over me, my legs stiff, my body aching, my throat dry from hours of unbroken walking. I walked along the road until I reached the parking area where my car was parked, keys still in the ignition, backpack leaning against the tire. Everything was ordinary again, the sun low on the horizon, the air cooling. But I couldn't shake the image of the campsite, the tent gone, the fire pit cold, the footprints scattered in impossible directions. Weeks later, I ran into a ranger at a different trailhead. I mentioned what had happened casually, trying to sound rational, not like a person on edge. He nodded, as if he understood immediately, and told me something I hadn't known. People sometimes walked in circles in that forest for days. He explained that the trails were not as linear as they seemed, that subtle landmarks could trick the mind, and that some campers didn't realize they were looping until someone else found them. Most of the time, they would eventually retrace the same steps, land back at the same spot, and assume they had been lost temporarily. Few ever realized how many loops they had made. It explained everything in a way that made sense. My tent missing, the fire pit cold, the footprints leading in every direction but the one I had traveled. I had walked in a loop without realizing it, over a trail that had shifted, misremembered landmarks, and the forest had done its quiet work. It was terrifying in a simple, human way. The forest didn't need tricks, it didn't need magic. It was easy to get lost, easy to convince yourself the world outside your memory had changed. And I knew now that the forest didn't care. It would wait patiently for anyone who wandered in, letting them retrace the same steps, feel the same unease, and finally emerge exhausted, humbled, and alert for the rest of their lives. I never took that trail again alone. I returned once with a group, following marked paths and using a GPS. The forest was no less beautiful, no less quiet, but I watched every step, counting, noting landmarks, never trusting my memory alone. The lesson stayed with me. Even familiar places can shift when you aren't paying attention, and sometimes the simplest explanations, a trail that loops, subtle misdirections, your own assumptions, are enough to make the world feel like it is moving beneath your feet. I decided to go on a solo camping trip on a long weekend in early October. The weather was dry, the air crisp but not cold, and the forests around the area were quiet. I wanted solitude, the kind of quiet that comes from being completely disconnected from roads, cars, or any human noise. I packed light but thorough, a small backpack with a tent, a sleeping bag, stove, food for 2 days, water, and a headlamp. I drove to a trailhead I had never used before. It was small, gravel-strewn, bordered by pines and oaks, with barely enough room for 2 cars to pass. I parked, double-checked my gear, and started down a trail. The trail was clear at first. Dirt packed hard beneath my boots, dry leaves scattered in random patterns. I passed through areas of open sunlight that warmed my back and pockets of shadow where the forest was thick and cool. The air smelled like pine, dry soil, and the faint rot of fallen leaves. Birds called intermittently, a distant woodpecker tapping at a tree, and the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. The path was easy to follow, with occasional markers nailed to trees. I walked at a steady pace, noting the bends and landmarks. Large rocks, twisted roots, a hollow oak. By late afternoon, I found a small clearing I decided to use for my campsite. The ground was uneven but dry, covered with a thin layer of needles and leaves. I set up my tent slowly, hammering stakes into the soil until they were secure. I unpacked my sleeping bag and stove, arranging everything with care. Then I walked around the clearing, gathering small sticks and branches for a fire. The forest felt calm, almost too calm. The shadows were long, stretching across the ground, and the sounds of the woods seemed muted, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. I built a small fire in the pit I cleared and cooked a modest meal. The flames licked the edges of the pit, the light throwing flickering shadows across the surrounding trees. I sat, warming my hands, listening to the faint burble of a nearby creek, the occasional whistle of wind through branches. As darkness fell, I noticed how isolated I was. The nearest road was a mile back, and the trail I had come on was narrow and winding. The thought of someone else being near seemed impossible, yet a small part of my mind couldn't stop thinking about it. The night was quiet, save for the normal sounds of the forest. Insects buzzing faintly, a distant owl, leaves rustling under the wind. I stayed up late, watching the fire burn low. When it died down to embers, I covered it with dirt to prevent sparks and climbed into my sleeping bag. I had set the tent so that I could see the trees in front of me through the small mesh window, a habit I had developed over years of camping. I thought it would make me feel more connected to the forest, more aware. Around 2 a.m., I woke to a noise. At first, I thought it was the wind, a low, dragging sound like heavy fabric being pulled over dry leaves. But it wasn't regular. It wasn't the wind. It had a rhythm, uneven but deliberate. I lay still, listening. The sound came again, soft, scraping, deliberate. I strained to see through the mesh. The forest was black, shadowed, nothing moving except the occasional sway of branches in the breeze. I gripped my flashlight, careful not to make sound, and waited. The sound moved, not steadily, not fast, but in short, uneven steps. It was outside the clearing, among the trees, circling without purpose I could discern. My first thought was another hiker, but the trail had been clear and no one could have come so quietly or without leaving a trace. The steps were deliberate, the pattern strange, stopping for minutes, starting again, always at a distance where I couldn't see what it was. I stayed awake, muscles tight, my hands resting on the zipper of the tent, afraid to move, but also afraid to close my eyes. Hours passed slowly. Every small sound made me jump. The rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig, the creak of a branch. I never heard voices, never saw anything approaching the tent directly. But the feeling of being watched, of not being alone, persisted. My fire was gone, reduced to cold embers, and I could see the moon moving slowly across the sky through the gaps in the trees. By 5 a.m., the noise had stopped, but I remained alert, unwilling to relax. When the sun rose, pale and orange, I unzipped my tent carefully. The forest looked normal, peaceful, quiet. I stepped outside, scanning the area for tracks, signs of anyone else, but saw nothing. No footprints, no moved branches, no indication anyone had been near. My fire pit was intact, the surrounding ground undisturbed except for my own marks. I packed slowly, double-checking my gear, alert to every sound. The wind, the shifting of leaves, the distant call of a bird. I began the hike back to the trailhead. The path felt longer, more winding than I remembered. At one point, I realized I was briefly unsure of which direction to take, though I had marked landmarks carefully. The memory of last night's sounds lingered. Every crack of a branch, every scrape of leaves made me tense, waiting for something that might not even exist. I kept moving, sticking to the main path, staying alert, until finally the trail opened back onto the gravel parking lot. Once I reached my car, I sat for a moment, letting relief wash over me. The forest behind me looked harmless in the daylight. The quiet, isolated clearing, the dark trees, and the noises I'd heard all night seemed like distant memories, though they had felt very real. I drove home slowly, checking my mirrors, glancing at the edge of the woods, still tense, still aware. Weeks later, I analyzed my mental state, trying to understand what had happened. The sounds I heard were probably not supernatural. They had to be human or animal, though I never saw any tracks. Perhaps another hiker had been on a parallel path, moving quietly, or perhaps it had been a deer or a group of deer, stepping on dry leaves, making strange rhythms with their hoofs. The mind, especially in isolation at night, can play tricks, combining sound, shadow, and memory into something that feels deliberate. I realized I'd been on edge, alert to every sound, interpreting natural forest noises as something intentional. The experience left a lasting impression. I never camped alone in unfamiliar areas at night without extra preparation. I began marking trails carefully, using GPS and recording my path when I stayed overnight. I made sure to note every landmark, every bend, every potential hazard. The forest was beautiful, quiet, and isolated, but it was also easy to misinterpret, easy to feel disoriented, and easy to imagine intentions that weren't there. That trip taught me that the woods themselves aren't malicious, they're just indifferent. Every sound, every movement is part of a living, dynamic environment. The fear I felt was real, but it came from the combination of isolation, unfamiliarity, and the mind's natural tendency to assign patterns and meaning. I never heard the scraping steps again, and I never saw another human in that clearing. But the memory stayed, a reminder that even ordinary forests, quiet and empty by day, can feel completely unpredictable when you are alone, alert, and unsure. The lesson was clear: respect the environment, be prepared, and understand that the forest can create its own form of terror through natural means alone, without anything supernatural or fantastical.